Are you confused about the ending of Bendy Chapter 5? There are so many questions that seem unanswered when you finish the game, so what could it all mean? For instance, who is the child that Joey speaks to? Who wrote the seeing tool messages? Who are the Alice Angel and Tom that help Henry? And what is actually happening to Henry? In this video, I answer these questions and more. Watch on to find out the answers. First, let us take 30 seconds to be clear about the chain of events in the studio. Henry, the protagonist, is invited to Joey Drew's studio since Joey Drew has something that he wants to show him. Henry then enters the studio, powers on the ink machine, and travels deep into the depths of what became of it, with no memory of how it expanded so much since he left 30 years ago. Along the way, he meets other employees who have been transformed into monstrosities until he finally gets to face off against Bendy, after a little help from an Alice Angel and a Boris. He defeats Bendy by showing him an ending reel, then is transported to Joey Drew's home, where he is directed back to the start of the studio to do everything all over again. Then we hear a child ask Uncle Joey for another story, thus leading to the first point of confusion. What does it mean when Henry returns to the studio? To answer this, we need to remember what actually happens in Chapter 1. Henry enters the studio, turns on the ink machine, and falls to some of the lower floors, then walks into a magic circle that causes him to faint. This results in some heavy damage to Henry's head, which we can see from the ink effects on the screen, and what Henry says when he comes back into consciousness. All Henry did was walk into the circle, so why did it affect his head to the point of collapsing like a Jenga tower? On Joey Drew's notice board, we can see a sketch of a magic circle identical to the one that Henry fell unconscious on, meaning that Joey Drew had definitely prepared this for Henry. Also, in Thomas Connor's report on his workshop at the studio, he mentions that his job starts to veer off the feats of engineering and starts to enter that of magic.
What started as a machine to simply mold life-size figures now seems to be teetering on the edge of magic more than engineering.
Considering these things along with the fact that Henry must return to the studio no matter how many times we complete the story, it becomes clear that Joey is some kind of wizard. Or at least he was able to use supernatural forces to trap Henry, forcing him to go on an adventure to reach Joey Drew just to be sent back to that same adventure. And as many of you have probably thought, this goes on seemingly infinitely. How can we be so sure about this endless cycle? The flashbacks. Henry experiences quick flashbacks of the ink machine, Ink Bendy's full body in an area of the studio he hadn't even seen yet, and Joey Drew's wheelchair, which he also hadn't seen. These flashbacks had to have been fragmented subconscious memories that Henry had in previous chapters through the studio, since he only gets to see Ink Bendy walking around and the wheelchair much later on in the story. You could argue that Joey Drew was disabled at the time Henry was working with him, but it doesn't explain how Henry briefly recalled seeing Bendy walking around an area that was definitely an extension to the studio, judging from the design of the hallway, that is. Remember that Henry said he was unable to recognize entire sections of the studio from when he last worked there, and this was when he entered the music department and Heavenly Toys. Heavenly Toys is the first area we see hallways similar to that in the flashback, therefore it had to be an extension to the studio that Henry was recalling in his flashback. He just couldn't strongly recall it in his conscious mind. You could even say that he was experiencing a premonition of what was to come, almost like a deja vu effect. But it makes more sense that these flashbacks were from the deepest depths of his mind. From all of this, it seems as if Joey had lured Henry into the studio just to turn on the ink machine and repeatedly live out the same nightmare like a mouse in a maze. Henry essentially became Joey's prisoner. But for what reason? After all, Henry and Joey are best pals, or so they both address each other that way, so why would Joey have bad blood towards him? This stems from way back when they first started working together at the studio. In Chapter 3, Henry's recording mentions that he was the one drawing the cartoons and that Joey Drew was just a man of ideas. Joey would make Henry do more and more work, expecting him to bring more to the company than he himself did, even at the expense of Henry's family time. At the end of Chapter 5, we find out from Joey that Henry left the studio to be with his family, while Joey just stayed and built a crooked empire.
In the end, we followed two different roads of our own making. You, a lovely family. Me, a crooked empire.
Remember that Henry wasn't just working for Joey Drew. His audio in Chapter 3 suggests that they were business partners, which means that they were dependent on each other to keep the company going. Unfortunately, Joey Drew stretched Henry to his limits, and when he left, he remained so blinded by his desire to make his dreams come true that he drove his company into bankruptcy while sacrificing his own employees. We also have to keep in mind that Joey had hired a small army of new employees after Henry left, especially in the animation department. According to Joey, Henry would have been like a little angel on his shoulder while running the company. Joey sacrificing his workers is something that Henry would have stopped had he stayed. He would have pushed Joey to do the right thing. Joey also appears envious that Henry took the time to raise a family, something noble, rather than the awful events that he orchestrated at his studio. As he puts it, his road burned, and he does blame Henry since it was their creations together that forced him alone to be consumed by greed. Thus, Joey would invite Henry to the studio to show him something, and that something would be a vengeful trap. a nightmare that Henry would have to revisit repeatedly. Or is it the same story each time? Some prodigies believe that Henry is stuck in a loop, but he experiences a different adventure with each visit to the studio. This is because Joey Drew is the storyteller here, and he has been storyboarding different concepts for an animated show called Bendy and the Ink Machine, which we can see on his desk in his living room. It would be fitting for us to be playing a game named after the show that Joey Drew is creating, and it makes sense that he would pitch this story to his niece to see if it would be a success when pitched to a studio. However, I've noticed that the storyboard here is continuous. Each of the pages run on from each other, and there doesn't seem to be an indication of separate episodes at all. There are so many pages, in fact, that these appear to be scenes for an animated movie. Perhaps it's a hint from the devs? Just kidding. Though it does seem like this storyboard tells a completely different story to that of Henry's, which leads me to believe that this storyboard is merely inspired by the characters that Joey left behind at the studio. As a stretch, he might have sent Henry there to spice up the story and give it a more human connection, putting Henry through the same trials and tribulations and recording his struggles until he finally got a story right. And that would definitely fit in with Joey Drew taking more than he gives. However, if he had repeatedly sent Henry back to the studio, surely Henry would have made an appearance by page 615. The main character does have to be fit in there at some point. You could even say that this storyboard encompasses the prelude to the game that we get to experience, as it shows scenes such as Alice Angel sawing up a Boris clone and Bendy having already taken the end reel, which is something that already happened when we played through Henry's adventure. I'm actually starting to think that maybe he did send Henry in there solely to give this story a happy ending, but we do have more to cover from the rest of the game. Regardless of Henry becoming part of this storyboard or not, there is still one story being told here, and there is more evidence of this. Something that I've noticed and was confirmed by the prodigies is that starting chapter 5 over and over again changes the date that we get to see on Joey Drew's calendar. This signifies that no matter what happens, the same core events of the game repeat themselves, and Henry ends up going to see Joey on different days of the year. No matter what day he ends up going to try to ask Joey questions, Henry goes through and is bounced back into the same story. And this is reflected in all of our playthroughs. Everyone gets a different date every time, and everyone experiences the same core events. The only thing that really changes amongst us and our individual playthroughs is how we move around the studio, and the order in which we take our actions. It's almost like the movie Groundhog Day. There is one dilemma when it comes to the story always being the same, and that dilemma lies with the seeing tool. With the seeing tool, we can see many messages written through the studio that would otherwise be invisible. The implication here is that someone, most probably Henry, had written the messages that we can see with this tool. It's sensible to suggest this because the messages are in such a tone that Henry would use, and they are in places that Henry would write. They also reveal or warn about events that Henry will encounter or experience in the future of his adventure, such as a warning not to turn on the ink machine when he enters the studio, and the message that reads, "She's heartless," a reference to imperfect Alice, who mutilates Boris clones and takes their insides. If Henry had written all of these messages, then there had to have been at least one timeline in the cycle where Henry was aware of what had happened and what was to come. Surely he wouldn't have used that timeline to experience the same story all over again. He would have done something to fix things and get out of there. But he doesn't. And instead he just leaves these invisible warnings behind, which if we heed, we can't even do anything about since the game plays on like normal. So what could possibly explain this? I think that the answer lies in what we see when we use the seeing tool on Perfect Alice and Tom Boris. When doing so, a halo appears above Alice's head and a bone appears in Tom's mouth, and these couldn't possibly be drawn in thin air by Henry and made to follow them around. Consequently, I think that the seeing tool merely reveals to its holder the subconscious memories that they held onto from the previous timeline in the loop that they experienced. And that was definitely a mouthful, but what I mean by that is that the messages that we see on the walls were not really written there by Henry, but rather kept in the deepest depths of his mind and amplified by the seeing tool. Perfect Alice said herself that she is no angel, but in Henry's eyes, she is caring and kind enough to fit the part of his angel. Tom Boris isn't the Boris that we all know and love, and Henry would have no reason to see Tom as his friend at all. That is until Tom saves him from being decapitated by Sammy. After that, they get over their unspoken differences and become comrades, and Tom helps us in much the same way, if not in a more useful way, than Henry's Boris did. Okay, Prod, hold up. What about Alice and Tom then? If everything is just a loop and nothing comes out of every cycle in the story, then how are Allison and Thomas out of the studio and happily married? Glad you asked that very specific question. My understanding is that as Joey Drew's dreams became bigger, he did more and more to make the employees at his studio unhappy. Besides the obvious sacrificing them to turn into toons and all sorts of monsters, the animations weren't getting done on time anymore, and Joey was running out of money. Not to mention that the studio was becoming very unsafe to work in. Considering that Alison Pendle and Thomas Connor ended up getting married, which we know because Alison took on Thomas Connor's last name in her letter to Joey Drew, there was a point in the studio where they shared similar sentiments about working there, and they quit before things got nasty. Thomas did say in one of his recordings that he would no longer be doing any more repair jobs for Joey Drew, and he eventually married Alison, so they must have fallen in love at the studio. Either that, or they were already in the early stages of a relationship, and Thomas recommended that Alison voice Alice Angel to fill in for Susie when she underwent her experiments. For this, Thomas had to have been there first to work on the ink machine that Susie's soul would be transformed by. Now, I have two interpretations of how this affected Perfect Alice and Tom Boris's true identities. One is that Alice and Tom are just regular monsters created by the ink machine. Alice doesn't consider herself to be an angel, despite being made in the image of one, and before coming into existence, she remembers just being a thought. The same goes for Tom Boris. Much like all the other Boris clones that we've encountered at the studio, Tom Boris is just another monster created in the image of a Joey Drew cartoon character. Alice has the ability to speak because she has that ability in the cartoons, much like the Butcher Gang members make rapid grunting sounds, and characters like Bendy and Boris did not. We should also remember that Susie Campbell was the first 3D Alice Angel, somewhat of a prototype to see what would happen when you infuse a soul with these 3D cartoons.
Susie, I'll be straight. I want you to bring Alice to life once again. What do you say?
After seeing the consequences of such a shady experiment, perhaps Joey decided against it for future toons. The other interpretation I have is that Alice was born using the soul of another character. We can see that Alice is skilled in repairing Tom's mechanical arm, and that she's very handy with other utility items, such as her rope.
How did you get down here?
It pays to carry a rope.
She is competent and extremely capable of being on her own and taking care of herself as well as others.
It's only for a few hours. No need to worry. I won't go far. Only up to level 6. But it won't be easy to open. I'll need 3 gears, a crowbar, some kind of counterbalance.
This sounds like a lot like another character we've heard of in the game so far. Do you know who that is? I'll give you a hint. Her name starts with L and ends in AC Benton. What? Linda Stein? No! Lacey Benton. We'll talk about Linda later. Lacey Benton is the one who would be handy with tools and other utilities, as she was based in the workshop with the robotic bendies. She also complains about other employees not knowing the difference between different tools, which means she has to have some kind of skill with those very tools. And the creepiest point? Lacey is an anagram of Alice. Just kidding, that one's just a cool little coincidence. But back on track, Perfect Alice does not refer to herself as an angel, she just calls herself Alice, which means that she has some sense that she isn't supposed to be an angel at all, but she just can't recall why. In becoming Alice, Lacey's soul, or thoughts as she puts it, would become one with the 3D print of Alice, so she would have the physical characteristics of Alice down to the acoustics that give her the same voice. It would also fit in Susie Campbell's interpretation of being born from and taken by the ink. Susie just knows more about the process because she was Joey Drew's guinea pig Alice. How about Tom though? Even though I've mentioned that Alice may be born from another worker's soul, who was Tom born from? In this scenario, I think that Tom was born as another Boris clone. When he first emerged from the ink when meeting with Alice, she called him Tom, which became the point where he was officially named. Also, it seems like Tom fancies Alice a lot, so perhaps he is just going along with the name to make her happy. However, to give a little more substance behind the kinda romantic tension between Alice and Tom, you know, besides writing her off as a furry, there is one soul that I think might have become Boris. To find out, we need the help of the seeing tool. Throughout the game, there are certain coffins that we come across with names on them, indicating that those characters died to aid in Joey Drew's rituals. The names we come across are Norman, Bertram, Susie, Lacey, and Grant. We can be pretty sure that Norman became one of the projectionists based on the achievement that we unlock in Chapter 3 titled Norman's Fate, which only unlocks when you defeat the projectionist in that chapter. And we know what happened to Bertram and Susie. That just leaves 2 potential lovebirds, Lacey and Grant. That is, if Grant didn't die from stress from managing Joey Drew's finances, or becoming that strange blob that we find in the management office of Level S. It might even explain that jaded, angry expression that Tom has all the time. This being said, I still think that Tom is just another Boris clone, but the possibility that Alice is LACIE is still there. The fact that she knows she isn't able to leave the studio is due to her actually dying, and not even magic could bring her back to the world outside. And speaking of the seeing tool, if this Tom was really Thomas Connor, he would have reacted to seeing Henry using the seeing tool on him, since in Alice Connor's letter to Joey Drew, she mentions Thomas being upset that someone stole one of his dusty old tools. At this point, there are probably tons of people out there screaming at me to talk about the child with Joey Drew. Many people believe them to be Henry's child or grandchild, which I thought was a really juicy proposition at first. How intense and twisted would it be for Joey to be so jealous of Henry that he would kidnap his child and send him to the studio to be trapped in an endless loop? However, I don't see much evidence for this at all. Some have said that this child is Linda, but Henry talks about Linda in his first 2 weeks at the studio, which opened in 1929. The scene with the child takes place in 1963, so unless Joey Drew discovered the Fountain of Youth, this child should sound more like they were in their 30s or 40s. I think that we need to take this scene at face value, and this child really is just Joey's niece or nephew. The more popular opinion is that they are a niece. For a bit of context, in many cultural situations, children often refer to their parents' friends as aunts and uncles. However, I think that the cell does not serve as very strong evidence for the cause of this child being Henry's at all. The cell was probably signed by Henry when he left the studio as it was gaining popularity. As Joey mentioned, Henry's path was focused on his family, and Joey's path was his crooked empire. If there's anything metaphorical about this cell, to me, it would be that it contrasts how Joey Drew's life became with how Henry left him in his prosperous days, and it amplifies Joey's anger towards Henry for getting the better end of the stick and leaving him with, quote-unquote, their creations. In a way, it's a beautiful yet terrifying way to show that the way Henry signed off on the cell when leaving Joey is the same way Joey signed off the letter when inviting him into his magical trap, your best pal. As far as things go with Linda, she was Henry's partner who he left the studio to start a family with, or at least to strengthen their existing relationship with, much like how Allison, Thomas, and Wally left to start or focus on their own families. And we all know that Wally had many opportunities to get out of there. Perhaps the one that he took was when he lost his stupid keys. Despite all of what we've talked about so far being very interesting, something that I wished there was a good reason for was why the last reel was Bendy's weakness. Bendy is literally an indestructible monster, strong enough to tear the head off other sturdy monsters. So why was he able to fizzle away when he was shown the words, "the end"? Besides Joey telling us that that is how he is defeated, and Bendy himself stealing the last reel, the only thing that I can come up with is that each of Bendy's cartoons never had a screen that ever said "the end." We've been wished a Merry Christmas and a Happy Halloween, but none of these toons have ever said these two simple words. Perhaps the reasoning behind this is more deep and meaningful than I hoped to delve, but it seems that Bendy's power remained so strong even after the studio had closed down because he never knew when to stop. The reason he never knew when to stop is because the cartoons he featured in never had a formal ending, so showing Bendy this ending would make it clear to him that it's time for him to finally rest in peace. Perhaps breaking Bendy's lair and placing the last reel in Bendy's throne causes the smaller ink machine to detach from where it lands, resulting in the game to start all over again. But explanations around this can get messy. For example, how do the tubes that Beast Bendy breaks get repaired? Does magic really explain everything that happens in the game? Just food for thought. While we've covered some major parts of the story already, I want to bring up some interesting points about Joey Drew's notice board that help to round off everything quite nicely. The note about the appointment with Dr. Hackenbush may be a reference to a character of the same name in the 1937 film A Day at the Races. The character was famous for singing a song with the line, "No matter what I treat them for, they die from something else." Perhaps this is a dark reference to the condition that put Joey Drew in a wheelchair, but whether he will die or not is up to interpretation. He was trying to achieve eternal life after all. There is also a letter approving bankruptcy for Joey Drew Studios, and the nearby electricity bill for his home showed that he never recovered from his spending habits yet, as he hadn't paid his bill for several months. Behind Wally Frank's letter is a company statement that may have been to look for volunteers to make their dreams come true, or in other words, become an ink monster, or to farewell employees when the company went bankrupt. There are Bendyland tickets and a poster to serve as mementos for what should have been for Joey Drew. Considering that Joey is storyboarding a movie for Bendy and the Ink Machine, perhaps these mementos show that he never let go of his dream. This may also contribute to him sending Henry into an endless loop at the studio. He could be doing it to make the money that'll make his dreams come true. There is a pamphlet showing that Little Miracle became a company that services radios and TVs, rather than the porta potties or closets that they used to make when Joey Drew Studios was still a thing. A small note at the bottom of the board shows that Joey's motto, "Just a pencil and a dream," changes to "Just a pen and a nightmare," an indication that Joey Drew's obsession had permanent consequences on his life. It may also refer to his current storyboarding project. The next one is a bit of a weird one. We can only see a little bit of it, but there's a picture of someone building a wall with a message below it that states, "Adequate shielding is the only effective means of preventing radiation casualties." This means that Joey was at one point interested in radiation protection, which takes me back to the seeing tool. Perhaps this tool is a radiation detector, and this whole time Henry has been exposed to this radiation. The seeing tool even makes a similar sound as a Geiger counter, which also detects radiation, and using it we can see concentrated specks all around the studio. However, this could just be explained by the time period that the game is set in. By 1963, World War II would have come and gone, sparking the start of the nuclear arms race. Essentially, the most powerful countries in the world started testing the capabilities of nuclear power by dropping nukes on the Earth. Yeah, totally smart idea. But without them, we probably wouldn't have had SpongeBob today. But that's a whole other conspiracy theory on its own. The main point is Joey Drew may have become paranoid by this and started researching in how he could build a safe shelter in case worse came to worse. Then we have the note that says Phil 203. Either Joey Drew is visiting someone called Phil at 2 o'clock on several days of the month, or he is referencing a Bible verse, Philippians chapter 2 verse 3. Nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. If it is this verse, it would be the final nail in the coffin to show that Joey was slowly learning from the situation. But it seems he didn't apply this principle to Henry, who he trapped forever. Hopefully Joey Drew's obsession with making his dreams come true ends up being worth it. And hey, there's always the opportunity for an undiscovered secret path, or a DLC, or even a sequel to give us a true happy ending for this story. Until then, Bendy and the Ink Machine has been an amazing adventure. The messages that we find using the seeing tool all tell different little stories on their own. Tap this video to find out more about that, or check out these videos which were picked just for you. Prodigies, I hope these theories helped to expand on how you think, and I hope you stick around for more fun on this channel with other games. See ya!